Thanks for all joining us. As Faye says, I'm David. I work for 9 to 5 for RSPB normally, including Haweswater, one of my reserves in the Lake District in Cumbria, along with I've had quite an active engagement with AGS, as been a member for a long time, a kind of grower. I show plants as well as being a kind of trustee and kind of know many of the faces who I'm seeing on the screen. So, yeah. So this is a bit of a sort of abridged version of a talk I did at the AGS conference 2 years ago, I think it is now, with a bit of an update to kind of see where we are and a bit of a glimpse into the future of where I'm hoping we're going to be going with the project. Just like to kind of point out at the start, the kind of project's really been successful because it's been a partnership of a new mix of partners together, really. So there's been Alpine Garden Society in terms of providing some of the funding for some of the work on conserving the native alpines, along with a range of other support. It's RSPB, my employer, who we manage this land. The land itself is actually owned by United Utilities, the water utility company in the northwest that supplies sort of 2 million residents of kind of Manchester from that reservoir. You can see there, and Natural England, who's the sort of English government nature conservation agency, who's responsible for sort of protecting some of these sort of special sites, which part of the project area is a triple SI. Right, let's see if it'll advance the screen. So we all love alpines. We all know what alpines look like and where they all grow. And this is a scene in the Spanish side of the Pyrenees near Jaca. You can see the kind of turf is alive with alpine flowers, some fantastic gentians in there. There's some sort of squill, and then there's that range of these things that are quite alien in the kind of upland landscape of Britain, these things called trees and scrub as well. You can see a kind of rich mosaic and lots of colour, and there'd be lots of noise there with all the kind of birds and the bees, and then that kind of fantastic craggy mountainous landscape, absolutely oozing in biodiversity. But unfortunately, you go for a walk in many of our kind of mountains and upland areas in the UK, and you're met with a scene not dissimilar to this. With my kind of ecological botanist hat on, a lot of our areas of mountains are somewhat of a disappointment and do look a bit like an ecological desert, often dominated by a small range of a limited number of pretty dull species that generally are fairly intolerant to grazing, which is why they're clinging on there. But that's not what we want to see in this country. We can do so much better. But why are we in that place? Well, kind of our native plants have been troubled over probably the last 200 years or more, with a range of things from kind of forestry in the top left there, overgrazing by sort of domestic livestock top right, our native herbivores, deer, in the absence of large predators, are on the increase, a range of other kind of more modern and unsustainable practices like earlier and earlier kind of cutting times for grass and meadow crops, sort of unregulated burning occurring on some of our peatlands, increased use of artificial fertilizers, drainage, and then something that I know the AGS is kind of not very proud of its sort of past legacy of past members going back over the kind of decades. But yeah, I mean, collection has been a bit of a problem for some of our rare mountain plants, and still is a problem to this day, with people, whatever reason, collecting rare plants in the UK. So RSPB, my employer, we've been actively involved in managing these kind of montane upland landscapes for decades. A lot of my work to date is largely centred around kind of restoring peatlands and kind of peat habitats in the sort of mountains and hills of, well, particularly in England. These are mostly pennine landscapes, and that's been involved in kind of trying to keep peat in the ground where it is, after years of kind of drainage, overgrazing and atmospheric deposition damage. But we've also managed a kind of range of other habitats, classic upland mountain habitats that you'd be familiar with if you kind of go to the Alps and the Pyrenees, places like that. So this is also at Haweswater. This was where we made our first foray probably into restoring some of the interesting plant communities. This is Swindale, one of the valleys on the reserve. And as you can see there, an absolutely outstanding display of kind of montane tall herb hay meadow communities. There's some melancholy thistle in the foreground, and these are triple SI meadows, and Natural England regard these as some of the best in England of high altitude meadows, much akin to some of the stuff you see on the continent, on where you go travelling. And changes in management that we brought about by shutting off grazing livestock earlier in the year, so they're not grazing after up until lambing period, has allowed some of these big, tall, bulky herbs to be able to flower. You can just imagine the herbaceous plants coming up in your garden, and you go nipping the tops off them in about February, March, just as they're in bud coming up. Well, that's effectively what grazing some of these habitats in March and April can do, is you effectively stop the plant flowering. It'll stop setting seed, you won't see it, and eventually it'll die because it's just been nibbled out every spring. So that crucial change, along with knocking in inorganic fertilisers on the headers, has really brought these habitats alive. And the other thing that we've started doing is kind of looking wider as well. So this is a Roadside Virgin, the foreground. Behind it, although it looks a blaze of colour with kind of yellow bulbous and creeping buttercup, that's pretty much a monoculture of about 5 species, that meadow. Yet this side of the road, perched on some nice limestone, you can see that that's, yet again, a meadow that would look not out of place in the Alps, with kind of meadow cranesbill, water avens, there's trollius in there, there's a whole range of orchids. They're really fantastic, and it's really understanding the land management changes of how that's happened to start impacting on some of our kind of most important plant communities, particularly in kind of alpine montane environments in the UK. So once we cracked restoring meadows, our attention moved up the hill to slightly higher altitude, and that image there is a view down the flooded valley of Mardale. Mardale village sat down in the bottom of the reservoir, was kind of cleared out. People resettled when that was flooded to provide water for Manchester. And left behind is Mardale. You can just see the old stone walls in the foreground of some of the old farms that were in the bottom there. But then right at the end of there, the home to our kind of conservation project, and the big peak at the back is Heart of Fell, and then going over the back onto High Street. And you can't quite see, but there's 2 glacial corries sat up in the top of there as well that are home to Bleewater and Smallwater, 2 big alpine, 2 very deep alpine lakes that sit up there in a really spectacular environment. Pardon me. But that landscape is classic of much of the Lake District, but unfortunately you don't have that riot of colour because of kind of years of neglect and misuse in that landscape has effectively degraded it, and many of those exciting species are either there and suppressed or have died out, unfortunately. So our work turned to the restoration of that higher altitude community. Like many of you probably on the call, I've also been very keen on travelling, and I've been leading tours for the last 15 years to various places around the globe. And this image here is of this is in Kazakhstan, in the Tian Shan Mountains on the kind of Kazakh-Chinese border. And one of the reasons I went here was it was a national park and a World Heritage Site, a bit like the Lake District. But this place had all its livestock removed about 100 years ago. And a lot of people often say you kind of remove the livestock, it'll turn barren, it'll be a wasteland. But I really wanted to see how some of these tall herb communities and juniper communities, quite analogous with what we've got in the UK and particularly in the lakes, were surviving just in the presence of natural herbivores. And I think seeing plants in situ of how they're growing, particularly without some of those pressures on them, gives you a bit of an insight into what you could be looking at. Also strayed north of the border, which from where I live is about 4 miles. Yeah, this is Ben Lawes, the sort of probably the British and certainly the Scottish mecca for kind of native alpines. Went up to meet with colleagues from National Trust of Scotland to go and look at the kind of restoration work they'd done on native alpines. This is woolly willow in the foreground, one of the kind of montane scrub plants that kind of Ben Lawes is famous for, and not just looking at some of the kind of the flowering plants, but also trying to understand some of these kind of montane scrub communities as well. Scrub, not a particularly sexy or attractive habitat in botanical terms or in the public's eyes, but some of these montane scrub communities are really rare and host to a range of exciting species, many of which many AGS members grow some of these dwarf montane willows, because I've seen many on show benches in the past. So it's really interesting plants. And it didn't take you long to understand what was going off. This is the Alpine Exclosure at Ben Lawes. You walk in the background there, you walk across a fairly barren, wrecked piece of montane grassland, and then you go through a big deer and livestock fence, and you end up in Edremuchy, where it's absolutely full of trees, scrub, all the dwarf shrubs are regenerating, and an absolute feast of kind of native wider countryside and alpine montane plant species flowering and thriving really well, and much more akin to the sort of things you see on the continent in places like Norway, in some of their sort of alpine zone. And really noticeable as well, bird song, butterflies, the smells, that the whole senses were there to kind of make you think, actually, I could be transported to southwest Norway or somewhere like that. Another place I also went for inspiration is, again, not far from where I live, is Caerphilly in the Scottish borders outside of Moffat. 2004, I think that is, top left, when a small community interest group bought out this bit of land, removed all the livestock and wild goats off of it, and underwent a kind of restoration plan. And then 2017, you can see the kind of difference that it's made. And 10 to 15 years tends to be the golden years of going from a fairly depauperate habitat into something that looks much more analogous to what should be there naturally. And that's also the phase when you can start to think about pushing some bigger herbivores on the kind of domestic livestock front back in there to start to create a bit more diversity. And the other thing that was noticeable about both Ben Lawes and Caerphilly is that many of these native alpine plant species, this is our native roseroot. This plant, normally when I see it in England and Scotland, is clinging within an inch of its life on a crag somewhere inaccessible. But it's really interesting to see when you take that pressure off of it, coming down the streams, erosion fans, bringing all this seed. And these stream sides were some of the first to get colonised by new seed source. Absolutely a riot with some of our sort of native alpine plants. So where does AGS come into this? So I'd not long, in fact, this was before I started as a trustee with AGS, but I knew that AGS was desperate to kind of develop a sort of alpine plant conservation project. They were keen to get into conservation, struggled for years to look for the kind of right projects. And I'd been thinking about this restoration project about restoring our own native alpines. And I thought, well, why wouldn't you start conserving your native plants at home? And that was when the seed of the idea was formed. And I put together a proposal for the AGS board at that time, proposing a project, but where it linked growers like Frank and Brian here from the kind of group up with me. So I'm really quite impatient. So as well as tackling the kind of problems that are impacting them at the moment, I want people to get out of that car park at Mardale Head and have the same wow experience that they'd have getting off a cable car in the Alps. So seeing some of these fantastic plants that aren't up on the rock ledges where you need climbing gear to get at, but seeing them around them with the butterflies, the birds, and the profusion of colour. Even the kind of people that aren't really interested in alpines or plants in general, who might just get out and go, wow, this is really colourful. It's not beige like everywhere else in our kind of upland landscape. So that's where this idea of potentially a project that both dealt with the overgrazing issues, but then it took the seed off these kind of refuge populations up on the crags and put them into the hands of skilled growers like Brian and others, and probably people on this call, to start growing these plants so we could start planting them back out to really speed up that colonisation process, and particularly doing it down at lower altitudes in really more obvious locations, which might take much longer to be colonised by native seed. So we dealt with the elephant in the room, which is, in this case, was a large flock, not of Herdwicks as in this photo, but we had a large flock of Cheviots that were on there. Commons, by their nature, are difficult to manage. They're unfenced, so you also get a lot of trespass grazing, which is where your neighbour's sheep come over, and in the absence of traditional shepherding practices, which used to occur tens of years ago, but still often occur on the continent, without good shepherding practice, you get inundated as soon as you move sheep off of a particular heft. So to deal with that, we had to introduce fencing. Which we don't like fencing stuff, but I see it as a temporary measure till we can all get on board across that landscape. So that map shows Mardale Head. Unfortunately, I've not got the that outline is actually what we call the Waters Heft. So that's one of our kind of commons heft units. But this is the Alpine Garden Society project is at the foot of Heart of Fell, and is within the kind of enclosure with the sheepfold in the end of it, right, really close to the car park. It's about 45 hectares in a block of about 1,200 hectares of common that we manage, including kind of blue water and small water. So that was where the kind of proof of concept project was to be held. This is Bleewater Corrie up in that heft. So you can see the sort of environment on the right. That's where many of the native alpines are still left clinging on. A bit of colour in there from some of the kind of dwarf shrub and things like greater woodrush and stuff like that. So these crag communities are a mix of sort of chasmophytic alpine, high altitude alpines like saxifragias, dryas, things like that, mountain avens, but also a mix of native montane scrub and shrubs like willows, some of the small compact willows, and a hay meadow community that effectively grows at that altitude, with also a slightly woodland community as well, with things like luzula, the kind of the woodrush in there. Generally where you find the dwarf shrubs like heathers and stuff, they were nibbled within an inch of their lives from kind of sheep and deer. And then, like everywhere else we've looked, all the really exciting plants are all clung onto the cliffs. Yes, a bit of brave full metal botanising to get up to see some of these exciting things. And this is with, bottom left is with Barbara Jones, who used to be ecologist for Natural Resources Wales, a leading member of AGS. And it was actually Barbara that wrote an article in an AGS bulletin about 5 or 6 years ago that I read on her work in Pyramidal in Wales, in Snowdon, that gave me the inspiration for, I'd like one of those in England, please, a project there. So it was great to get Barbara back to kind of look at what goodies we got on the cliffs and see the plans that we'd got in tow. So yes, I brought, so Barbara came with John Good. John unfortunately didn't fancy going quite up there, but Barbara was like a mountain goat like me and Lee and went up. And you can see things like roseroot, early purple orchid. Many of these plants people just wouldn't dream of at that altitude. And then, I mean, it's absolutely labyrinthine up there. It's a fantastic place to be. And yeah, but I just don't want that experience for people who can either get up there or have to use climbing gear to get to it. It should be available to all who step out of the car park, so they're as excited about alpines as I am. And some of those communities look absolutely fantastic. I mean, that looks like a fantastic garden in itself. And one of the things that we found out with the surveys was that those crags contain about a fifth of the English resource of what we call U17, which is a vegetation classification. It's effectively an upland, montane, woody meadow community based around Luzula sylvatica, the kind of woodrush, and Gianrivali, which is the kind of water avens. But you can see in there's a range of kind of roseroot, heathers, harebells. It's fantastic. And get poking about in there, amongst the scabious and stuff, and there's some really great plants in there. So some of the plants it's really important for that we've discovered. So holly fern, Polystichium longitis, the top left fern, a fern that was stripped out of existence pretty much by Victorian fern collectors. You can see on the map there, really only restricted now to bits of the lakes, dales, and then Scotland, small outliers in Snowdonia. Sidebells wintergreen, top right. I think bottom left, Sorcerera alpina, has the best English name of any native alpine plant. That's the Alpine Enchanter's Nightshade. And yet again, grows in kind of shady crevices under bracken at altitude. We've also got things like fork spleenwort, this interesting little fern on the right, with not many outposts in the UK. Salix herbaceae, There's a least willow, one of our smallest native shrubs, roseroot, and we've got bearberry bottom left, Arctostaphylos, as well as Alpine woodsia bottom right. And these were actually plants that were cultivated by Edinburgh Botanics a few years ago, taken from material both locally at Haweswater and in the Moffat Hills. And the population's been bolstered by some of those grown at Edinburgh. And Edinburgh have got some more plants, which I'm hoping they might fancy putting back out on site. And then other things like hermaphrodite crowberry, filmy ferns, mountain sorrel bottom left, and yellow mountain saxophrasia, not a particularly rare plant, but in terms of if you want a kind of poster plant to engage the general public, when you see mats of this bright yellow thing flowering in May, it's delightful. So we wanted to find out what plants we got. So this was really helpful in that we got some really great records from a kind of eminent botanist and naturalist who's unfortunately now dead, Derek Ratcliffe, who intimately captured the flora of Lakeland. So we've been out trying to rediscover some of Derek's records. This was a session out with Jeremy Roberts, a kind of Cumbria's sort of leading botanist. You can see some of the interesting terrain for botanising there. I think the camera angle makes it more precipitous than it was, but yes, out scouring some of these cliffs looking for some of these last vestiges of plants. And some of these plants are down to single species. We've done some road work where we've been in with climbing, and we've also been using drone technology here. You can just see the drone in the kind of top right of the image. This is looking for fork spleen work on some of the kind of really precipitous, quite scary areas. So yeah, using drone technology there to find and map some of these ledge communities. And we found some good stuff by going back to those Ratcliffe records. So this is Alpine Sorwa, Sorcerera alpina, a native plant that's it's not many places in England, not many places. It gets commoner certainly in the Breadalbanes and when you get up into Ben Lawes. But yeah, again, we got some records in the Haweswater area from the sort of 1960s, 50s, which were probably Ratcliffe records. Eventually, one of our volunteers, Kat, she went out, I think it's 2 years ago now, Kat eventually found this plant down to one plant, but the plant was probably about 3 meters by 3 meters, stuck precipitously on a ledge out of reach of grazing animals. So we found that plant, and we've now taken material, both seed off of it, which a few of us have had a go at growing, and Tom Freeth down at Kew has also managed to propagate some material off this that we've also banked into the Millennium Seed Bank at Wakehurst. And I took some divisions off of part of the kind of advantageous front on that to create some cuttings, because these are very difficult to grow from seed. So that's been a great win. Plants we're still looking for, which we know are probably still there, but won't start popping up till the grazing's been relaxed. Things like Purple Mountain Saxophrasia oppositifolia, probably my favourite British plant. Things like Moss Campion, yet again records from in that area, and also Alpine Saxophraga nivalis, or I think it's had a genus change now. But yeah, there's some old records of that up there. And in fact, Brian Burrow, I'm sure, said to me he remembers finding that plant up in the 70s or something in that area. So that's one still to be discovered, but probably hanging on in some shady ledge. And then the other thing we wanted to think about with this project was also kind of last refuges of plants. So this is the Pyramidal Beetle, down to tiny amount of sites in the UK, common on the continent, very intolerant of grazing and burning, down to one plant locally over the corner, well, a cluster of plants. So one of the other premises of the kind of conservation area was not just conserving what's in there, it's also about thinking what was probably in there and if we can offer it a safe home as a kind of refuge. So this plant is out on an adjacent common, it's got no protection, it's grazed within an inch of its life, it's not regenerating. That would be the last bit of genetic material from that bit of the Lake District, and it would be criminal if that disappeared. So I mean, we're not going to get stupid and start introducing kind of plants from the continent or plants from kind of North Scotland, but plants that are within a radius, working with partners, John Muir Trust and Natural England over the Helvellyn range, to start to put some of those plants back into that area where we've got good records of them, and particularly if we can take material locally. And Pyramidal Beetle is one of those plants that we've taken the seed off. And just as well, because last year someone tried digging the last remaining plant of this up. So yeah, we've now got seed, and I was out in the kind of Mardale Enclosure a week and a half ago, and we've got a vast amount of this flowering now. It tends to be quite monocarpic, but loads of seed coming on it, which will hopefully try and get some seed off to distribute, as well as putting some on the site to leave it to natural processors. So the seed exchange has been quite good. We've done a sort of special seed exchange where we've put the seeds of some of these plants into a range of kind of growers. They've mostly been local to kind of the north of England, just for ease of logistics. The seed's easy to post back, but obviously getting great big pots back is not as tricky, although I have used the AGS conference as a good way to meet up with growers to get plants back. As part of the project as well, we also put in a well-ventilated polytunnel to both help us with some of our kind of native montane willow propagation, but also somewhere where we could kind of receive and start to look after some of the plants as we bulk them up before putting them out, as well as, not this spring, but normally it rains quite a lot in the Lake District, so we also needed somewhere with some good welfare cover to house our volunteers as well, while they were potting them on and weeding them. So we've given the seed out, members have grown it on, and then we've done a number of days so far. The last one was last autumn, where we've been putting the plants back out, and we've also invited members along here. So there's kind of Jim McGregor and Alan Oatway there with my colleague Lee, planting junipers there by the looks of it. But we've been out on AGS planting days, and COVID might make it slightly difficult this year, but we've been inviting people out onto those planting days as well. So we've got a nice range of habitats and kind of altitudes and things to play with in the Mardale Exclosure. This is a snapshot looking down from Harter Crag. So we've kind of got screes, we've got Duderwick screes on the other slope, we've got some areas of kind of wet heath and bog down in the bottom there. And since we've kind of excluded livestock, the transformation has been incredible. So you can see the fence in the background there. That's the border of the AGS project area. Outside of it is our agro-environment agreement, but that's still open to quite a lot of trespass sheep at the moment. But all the seed source is coming down those erosional fans, and all that colour that you can start to see in the structure developing, all the white there is mossy Saxophrasia, one of our most attractive native Saxophragias, which is just seeding en masse. And there's nowhere else I've seen this in such profusion flowering, just because we've tackled the grazing problem in there. And the seed source above it is incredible. And there's a close-up of some of what the ground looks like. So you've got rowans regenerating, you've got lots of mossy Saxophrasia cropping up, ladies' mantles, there's a St. Johnswort in there. There's a huge range of native plants have all started to crop up and come to life. And I mean, yeah, that mossy Saxophragia, you could imagine that on a show bench. It's a fantastic floriferous flower. And just a range of dwarf shrubs as well. I mean, many people go to the Pennines and some of the moors there to see heather and stuff, and not many people associate it with the Lake District, but it just goes to show 3 years of excluding sheep out there. It hasn't gone, it's still there. This is Erica tetralix, a cross-leaf heath. This is a wet heath indicator species, and a bit of bog asphodel just to the left, the sort of brown faded flowers. So huge amounts of structure and species diversity has been coming back. Last spring, even orchids are coming back. So this is Orchis mascula, the early purple orchid. So you saw those pictures of me finding it up on the crags. This was down in the enclosure at kind of not much above where the car park level is. No one remembers orchids in that area in living memory, but they've either been in there suppressed or they've come, well, 3 years is probably pretty quick to go from seed to regeneration. But yeah, it's great to see things like orchids really taking place. And we found a whole range of plants in there subsequent in the springs that we never even knew were in there. And even the member planted plants are going well. So we have got Trolleus up on the cliffs, but these are some of the plants that members have grown and planted out. So this is our native globe flower Trolleus. Fantastic plant. Yeah, again, I mean, how many people really go to places like this in the Lake District and would expect to see trolleys? You probably think, well, that grows in a hay meadow, or that only grows in the Pyrenees or something like that. But this is a native plant that's super rare in these kind of sort of landscapes, just because it doesn't want to be grazed off. Yet the plants that we've put in there have done really well, thriving, setting seed now. So really encouraged by this. Yeah, we might get the odd one dug up every now and then, but hopefully getting them bulked up and out there in quantity starts getting people kind of really interested, taking pride in it, and it makes it much more resilient. When you're down to 1 or 2 plants, getting 1 or 2 dug up is pretty problematic. Hopefully, once you start multiplying them up, as they should be in their natural density, it can sustain the odd naughty person going nicking plants. So talking of nicking plants, this sort of leads me into some of the cons around it as well. So we've been doing a range of things to kind of communicate it, both in terms to our audience in the AGS. So I've written a number of articles, and Greg has, in terms of talking about it. I've done a couple of talks and do talks elsewhere. This was a nice article that was in the March edition of BBC Wildlife magazine, where we were talking about some of the project, and also the central part of it was really kind of the theft of the pyramidal bugle, in the fact that these things still are getting pinched in places. And it was talking about conserving some of our native alpines that myself and my colleague Lee particularly really interested in. So Lee kind of penned this article, I supplied some pics, and away we go. And actually on the back of the sort of encouragement and interest that Lee's had in this and seeing these habitats, Lee's just struck a deal with Penguin Publishers last week to write a book on this. So really looking forward to reading that in due course, talking about the kind of struggles to conserve some of these native plants and habitats in the lakes. So that's kind of it for me for my slides. Leave you there with a kind of an area of Haweswater with Mardale just in the background, and Riggindale and Harterfell in the background. And this bit in the foreground is a lower bit of Mardale Common, which we've had without grazing for a long time, where the junipers and stuff are really romping on. But yeah, I think it kind of gives a bit of a view to the sort of habitats we'd like to see, that gradation up the hill of all these kind of really important, exciting native plant species thriving, and then hopefully having people at the heart of that, seeing them and getting as excited as we are. And yeah, we'd love to see as many AGS members come and visit the place. We're hoping to do more interpretation on it, both for kind of the member sort of side of it, of both RSPB and AGS, but also trying to educate the kind of people that wouldn't necessarily go there looking at mountain flowers, that are just striding out to get up High Street or something like that. So some learning there from other places we've been to about kind of signing and illustrating the different plants that are coming up to show people as they go along. So yeah, that's it from me in terms of slides. I'd now like to kind of invite questions.